My name is Jeanette De La Rosa Duca, and I'm going to show you how to create training following sound educational theory. Before we begin talking about how to create instructional materials, what you want to do is to think about that there is actually a difference between training and education. A lot of my early career and education and graduate research work was as an educator. But for the past decade in the profession, I've learned that there is a distinct difference between training and education. And so I wanted to bring that out by sharing with you what that might mean. So you might ask yourself, what is the difference between training and education? Well, one, which is training, generally tends to transmit skill. Whereas education, when you're talking about educating people, what you're trying to do is to pass on knowledge. In general, when you're trying to teach a skill, what you're doing is you're attempting to explain how to do something. But when you're educating people and transmitting knowledge, you're trying to develop an understanding of why something is the way it is. So there are two examples that I often use to illustrate the difference. First, if you had a pilot and you wanted him or her to learn how to fly, you generally want that person to take flight school training, where they learn the hows of operating the airplane. That's different than an aeronautical engineer who maybe goes to an educational institution to figure out why an airplane flies. Another example I like to use is that perhaps you've gone through it when you learned how to drive. There was probably a time when you took an educational course figuring out why it was important to follow the rules of the road and learn the laws and regulations and the importance of complying with the motor vehicle requirements set out for you. But that was different than actually learning to get into a car and taking training on how to operate a vehicle. And my last example that I wanted to share in illustrating the difference between training and education requires you to think about how it would be if you were a parent. So imagine that you were a parent and you had a daughter, and your daughter told you after one day of school that she had gone and had taken sex education at school. You would think that that would be pretty cool because perhaps she learned biology and how babies are made and all those other things you learn when you discover sex education. But it would be very different if your daughter told you that she had taken sex training. So there then lies the difference between one being an aspect of demonstrating knowledge and trying to answer the question why, and another trying to actually transmit skill, and that is training. Certainly there is a bit of overlap between the two. One informs the other, and they are not necessarily independent. You use a bit of education in explaining why something is so important when you train, and vice versa. When you train, you certainly integrate aspects of education. So I bring this up because this distinction between training and education should drive the kind of instructional materials we are delivering and designing. When we are talking about training people, we want to make sure we pass on skills and how to do something different in terms, in essentially a behavior change. We don't necessarily want to inundate people with a lot of information about why it's important. Certainly have that in there, but make sure that by the end of the course people know how to do something different. So we can do that using a model known as backwards design, which was brought up by educators known as Wiggins and McTeague, who said that you can certainly encourage understanding by smart design of your instructional materials. It begins with thinking about the end in mind. So before you even begin creating instructional materials, whether it's your presentation or your handout, or your outline, or your lesson plan for the day, you want to identify your desired result. What is it that you want by the end of the course for people to know how to do differently? We speak about objectives in this way. So after you identify what you want people to do different, Your next step is to create some kind of a way to measure successful completion of those objectives, or specifically an assessment. Often when we think about assessments, we think about perhaps creating a test. So generally, you want to know what you're going to teach, identify objectives, and then create some kind of assessment that proves that individuals who took your course had achieved successfully the objectives you've identified. And then, and only then, do you start to develop your instructional materials or your content. So often what we do is we start with the content, and we fill the content in with a bunch of information. But if you do it that way, you're not really mapping out a structure in your course. You're just kind of putting things all down, which is helpful. But certainly, there must be a better way to go about designing content, and that is through this backwards design process. So let me share examples of how to implement this backwards design process now that I've described the 3 steps of identifying objectives, creating an assessment, and then developing your content around the assessment. When you create an objective, it's really helpful to use this fill-in-the-blank kind of a question, which is, by the end of this course, you should be able to, and answer that question with the different things that you want people to do different. What's a really helpful tool is to use higher level kinds of objective adjectives, such as apply, right? By the end of this course, we want people to apply something, or evaluate another thing. Or perhaps by the end of the course, we want them not only just to apply or to evaluate, but we want them to actually create something new or different. So when you create an objective, when you're trying to figure out your desired result, try to answer the question, by the end of this course, you should be able to apply, evaluate, or create something. That then brings you to the next step, which is assessment. For every single objective you've identified, what you want to do is come up with a way of demonstrating that it was successful in a measurable way. So I'm going to use a test as an example. If I were creating a test as my assessment, I would want to make sure that for every objective, I have a test question that measures that objective. So for example, one of the questions I might ask is a question around where. And I might have a multiple choice set of options. And by the way, for every multiple choice set of options, you want to make sure you have at minimum 4 options for people to choose from. That test question should always match at least one of your objectives that you have identified earlier. I might want to ask as another assessment question, when? When did Y happen? And that when did Y happen should be closely correlated to this evaluate objective I've identified earlier. And so forth. If I want to know what something was, I certainly can give options in my test and make sure, again, that that test question matches an objective that I have identified earlier. So once I've identified the desired result, or once I've identified objectives for my course, I then should create a test, and the test should closely align with the objectives. Otherwise, we're creating tests that are random and not really measuring what we wanted the course to uncover for our students and participants. So after you create objectives and assessment, then you can go ahead and create the content. And really, the content becomes an outline of how people can successfully achieve the assessment. So therefore, when you are creating your content, and if you've asked on your test question something about X, for example, you want to make sure you have something about that X, and in your content, give them the answer you want them to achieve on the test. Same thing with the next test question, which again is based on one of the objectives that I've identified earlier. You want to create that content, whatever it may be, and make sure you give them in that content, whether it's a PowerPoint slide or a handout, you want to give them the answer to the assessment question you are expecting people to achieve by the end of your course, and so forth. It could be about anything, laboratory safety, it could be about fire extinguishers, it could be about how to boil an egg. No matter what you do, create content that is very, very closely aligned to the expectations and the measurable objectives you've identified earlier. So, this backwards design process really requires you to think first about what you're expecting to teach at the end of your course. And only after you've identified those objectives and created your assessment do you then start to outline the content. And what's really cool about that is it makes it so that your content is very structured and it's streamlined. And certainly you can provide quite a bit of information within that content, explaining the answer to the test questions or the assessment that you've identified earlier, but it's limited because your focus, again, is on providing the answer to the assessment that is linked to an objective. And that is just the first stage of designing a training course. So after you've used a backwards design process to identify your objectives, create your assessment, and outline your content, essentially what you're doing is, again, you're outlining. In this stage, you're identifying objectives, and you're creating an assessment. You're doing these three things before you start delivering a course. And before you start delivering a course, you need to move on to a next stage of an instructional model that says, after you design, let's start to put it all together, let's assemble it. Let's develop your course materials. What I often say is that during this phase, what you're doing is you're adding to your outline any photos you've taken. Perhaps you are able to produce your own videos, and this is a time to embed them or even perhaps take them from online. Or you're starting in this way to look at the text that you are putting together and formatting it with color and size and symmetry and making it palatable. So essentially you're adding to your outline all of those assets that eventually will become your training course. So once you become comfortable with what you've put together in terms of putting all your course materials all into one thing, whether it's a PowerPoint slide or a handout, what you want to do in this development process, in this assembly process, is to make sure you put it together in such a way where it is not inundated with a lot of information. Very often, what I've done in the past is I've put together a lot of information upon information upon information upon information. I've done this, but I've also been a student or a participant in a course where this has been done to me, where I've been through a training or through a class and I've been given a lot of information, and perhaps at the end I might have been asked a question around what I was given as information, and it might or might have not been linked to some kind of a skill that I was expected to learn. So this whole process of providing information upon information and on and testing at the very end may not necessarily always work. And if you've ever been in a class where you've taken a test and never went over it during class, you've been victim to the same process of ongoing assembly of information without a proper structure. What I often say is that when you're developing your outline and putting it together with some graphics and some images and some videos and formatting it, what you want to also do is to assemble it in such a way where it is completely active in the learning process. So what that means is that you should always try to have some kind of a piece of your content that, again, focuses on how, because this is a training course, and right after that very short blip of content showing them how to do something, then right away ask them some kind of a question or present a scenario. And what's cool about this is that by this time you've already, through the design process, created an assessment, and that assessment can be used as part of your instructional materials. But essentially what you're doing is giving some instruction on how to do something and then testing people on whether or not they've achieved that how. So essentially, if people do very well and they pass that test question, for example, and they've actually learned something, then you can move on to the next kind of procedure on how to do something different. But if they fail, and only if they fail, that's the time that you pull out information. You give them the information that essentially is feedback for why it is that they might have failed or not answered your assessment properly, and then go back to review, again, how to do that procedure that you're sharing with them. And hopefully by the end of that repetition, you can go back to the assessment so that they would pass and move on to the next piece of information that you're trying to give to them or procedures you're trying to share with them, get assessed again. Again, if they fail, only then do you provide information. And again, provide the feedback that leads right back to how to do something different. And again, you assess them. So it's this ongoing process of creating your instructional materials so that you design it right from the very beginning and perhaps recycle your assessment into the process of putting it all together. But that it's not an ongoing slide after slide after slide of information overload, and perhaps at the end questioning people and hoping and praying that they would get some skill out of it. You at the very beginning focus on the skill. Test or provide a problem-based scenario around whether they've acquired that skill. If they fail, provide them information to learn again how to hone in on that skill and then move on. But it's a series of showing how, assessing, showing how, and assessing until you're done achieving the objectives you've identified at the end of your course. So this development phase is pretty important, but it should be done only after you've designed something. Following this backwards design process. But hopefully by the end of this development phase, you've started to assemble your content. And what I often say is don't just assemble your content, kind of get feedback. Have somebody go through your process or teach and practice in front of them and see if you're successful in transmitting skills, if this is a training course that you're trying to implement. So after you've designed your course, hopefully using the backwards design process, and after you've developed your training materials, using this process of assembly that incorporates focusing on skills and scenarios and giving people information only after they have not successfully passed your assessment, then you can go ahead and do the next phase of this process of instructional design, which is to implement. When you implement your course, what you essentially are doing is you're either delivering it if it's a classroom-based training, or you're publishing it and distributing it if it's an online training course. It's at this stage where you actually get up and share. Share the skill that you're trying to teach, for this is, again, a training course. And this can be done as an instructor-led class, or it can be done online. If you are delivering it, or if you are implementing it in an instructor-led training class kind of a venue, what you want to make sure is that you incorporate what is known as active learning techniques. Active learning techniques include the use of such things as case studies or problem-based scenarios or role-playing or mind mapping, anything to get the participants involved in the content. So you want to, as much as possible, take yourselves out of this realm of being the lecturer in front of the class and more into this role of facilitating equally with your students, providing them information, but certainly let them work through whatever it is that you're teaching them. If it's an instructor-led training course, what you want to do is make sure you build in, as much as possible, the scenarios that we talked about earlier in the development process. So some of the best online training courses that are out there are ones where there is the least amount of speaking from the narrator's point of view, and there is more questions, and you bring the audience into sometimes a different room, almost gamifying your course. And you do that by the use of scenarios. What you're trying to do here, whether it's an instructor-led training class and incorporating active learning, or whether it's an online training course incorporating scenarios, is you're trying to focus on transmitting, essentially, learning, or hopefully adult learning, what is known as andragogy. And that's very different than this idea of trying to be somebody who generally transmits pedagogy. The difference between the two is that andragogy, again, is the techniques that you incorporate to encourage learning, whereas pedagogy is just almost always focused on how to teach. If what we're trying to do in delivering educational initiatives is to incorporate and encourage learning, then we need to focus less on the actual teaching and more on the facilitating of learning. One of my favorite educational philosophers, Paulo Freire, said that traditional pedagogy often treats students as if they were vessels to be filled up with information. Kind of like a piggy bank, right? And that information is what traditionally we believe is important for them to know. Paulo Freire said that this is a banking concept of education, that when you treat students as nothing but vessels to be filled up with information, you are disrespecting the fact that they may be actually not more knowledgeable than you, or able to, in essence, co-create knowledge with you. And so instead of focusing on traditional pedagogy, try to focus on andragogy. And the way that you can do that is to take yourself out of the role, again, of teacher and become a co-creator of knowledge. And you do that by incorporating active learning techniques in an instructor-led class or scenario-based kinds of training in an online course. So again, you want to initially design your training or design your courses with the end in mind, creating the objectives, identifying assessment, and creating your content. Assemble it with this sort of pattern of sharing how to do something and then presenting a scenario, giving information only if people fail, and then moving on from there, and then delivering it or implementing it, but using active learning techniques or scenario-based training focused on andragogy and getting away from traditional pedagogy, which is just filling people with information. That kind of gets into a little bit of education, so that's another reason why we want to have people co-create knowledge with us, but certainly focus on the skills of how to do something when we are teaching them a course. Another step in the creation of instructional materials is to evaluate. You always want to make sure that you're constantly improving and receiving feedback in whatever way about what you're doing. And this can be done very easily in an online method. What you can do is that at the end of your training or education or your course, you can put in a little link to a survey which asks questions about how people may have felt or what they had learned or what the effect they believed was on their behavior as a result of the class. If you're doing an instructor-led class, you very simply can pass out on the last day a survey that people fill in anonymously. But what you're trying to do when you evaluate is you're trying to focus on what is known as Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation. And that is that there's a difference between how people feel about a class, and there is a difference between whether they actually learned anything from a class. There's also a difference between whether the class created a change in behavior, and finally, whether the class actually impacted the end result, usually at the organizational level. So when you evaluate, create a survey that tries to ask questions around whether people actually liked your class, what they thought that they had learned at the end of the class, and sometimes this learning is just a repetition of some of the assessment questions you've designed earlier and put into your development process. There's another level of evaluation that is not often easily acquired through a simple survey. It often requires you as a facilitator to go back into the environment to see if your participants or your students had changed in any way in their behavior because of your class. But you can still ask on your survey whether they believe that their behavior has changed as a result of your course. And finally, the last level of evaluation gets into often what's known as return on investment, to see if there is any kind of a change in organizational results. Sometimes, for example, if there are ongoing injuries, the same kinds of injuries, we can see if creating a course will change those trends, perhaps reduce the injury rates. And so at this level of evaluation, that's something that we could figure out, but it would require a lot of data collecting and analytics. And so it's very difficult usually to do results-based evaluation. However, if you're talking about a process of creating instructional materials, you always want to try to get feedback. This is known as summative evaluation, and your feedback can be very just simply whether people had a good reaction to your course. And that can be telling about the kinds of andragogy and pedagogy you had implemented if it's an instructor-led training class, and as well as the kind of scenarios you had put people through in an online training course. The truth is, this whole process of designing and developing and implementing and evaluating courses starts with the very first step, which really is kind of an ongoing spiral. And the very first step, before you even begin any of this, before you jump into a class and start teaching, or before you begin to develop a PowerPoint presentation and put your content into it, you want to first analyze whether this course is what you should be doing to begin with. Sometimes it's not. So during the analysis phase, what often is done is we look at metrics to see if there is a need to have a course. And we use that information in whatever form it may be to generally judge and weigh whether it's appropriate to have whatever it is that you're trying to transmit in a course, or sometimes things are best left outside of a course in the media, such as through a website or through an email, or sometimes it's better if you want to get something out into the world to use communications to do it rather than a training course or an educational class. So during this analysis phase, which really is the first step you should be taking, you look at what's happening and you weigh it against really the resources that you have, including the time that it takes to do this process. And you decide from that point whether it's worth it to create a training course. In essence, what you're doing is you're conducting a needs assessment. You're conducting a needs assessment to determine what you're going to do, whether it's worth it, and the resources that are needed to follow this process. This process happens to be a well-known model called ADDIE, which stands for Analysis, Design, Development, Implementation, and Evaluation. It's a sound instructional model that's been used for several decades that talks through the processes of creating instruction and making sure it's comprehensive by putting in pieces of evaluation and analysis and making sure that you implement it in such a way as to encourage learning, which hopefully was the goal of your course to begin with. In summary, whenever you're creating training, you want to follow sound instructional theory, and that means applying backwards design in the creation of instructional materials, incorporating adult learning theory and adult learning principles when delivering a course, and then following an instructional model so that you can make sure that your educational initiative is comprehensive. And the model that we talked about today is the ADDIE model of Analyze, Design, Develop, Implement, and Evaluate. My name is Jeanette De La Rosa Duca, and that is how to create training.